Welcome to Devil's Advocate, a show where I discuss both sides of an argument, and in this particular case, I'm discussing should or should there not be women-only esports tournaments within the wider esports ecosystem. And recently, ESL had announced that they are doing a $500,000 tournament for women only. And so here we will discuss both the nuances of the particular aspects of this, maybe the cons or the pros of such arguments, and to maybe get a better understanding of both sides and how maybe they articulate their said arguments. I will first go into both opponents in terms of having them state their initial statement, and then we will both go into an open discussion to where both parties can address maybe what has been said across the other party. The purpose of this entire series, in fact, is to get an open dialogue of both different arguments and to learn the different perspectives of maybe a particular different opposing party. I think this is very important to progress the entire scene because at the end of the day, we don't really accomplish anything if all we're doing is just arguing over each other rather than listening to the different perspectives of each particular party. Even if you strongly disagree with them, it's very important that you understand their argument so that maybe you can persuade them in future said conversations to then change the entire scene. So with that said, welcome to Devil's Advocate. So to first start off with, I think many people can agree that there are more male gamers than female gamers. The reason why this is hard to get an actual good statistic is because, a lot of the pleb scientists out there aren't really gamers and they don't define what a gamer is. Like, how many hours does it take? Does it matter if you play on mobile games, right? Because typically hardcore gamers wouldn't consider mobile to be, a gamer type or hardcore gamer type thing to do. So all the statistics are very bad on this subject, and there really has been any real great data in regards to the female versus male ratio when it comes to just being a gamer in general of what many would define as a gamer if you are a gamer. But with that said, I think it's safe to assume that we can say a lot of the major esports and whatnot, it's heavily skewed towards the male demographic, right? You're thinking of like 65-35 or something. So with that said, why do we need female-only or women-only esports tournaments? Well, you have to figure, first of all, just the idea of role models, I guess, and the fact that this does give a clear indicator, or rather a clear representation of a good female role model. I like to make the comparison of maybe what happened in the early 90s when it came to hip-hop, and the fact that hip-hop suddenly it wasn't just an underground thing, it became a cultural phenomenon. It was more in the sense of in the spotlight of pop. And so now you had a huge, large representation of largely black men being at the forefront of stage as what is considered to be pop culture. And then that moved over into Hollywood. And so now more Hollywood actors or black actors started to get recognition and representation over in Hollywood. And sometimes, even hip hop artists transferred over into Hollywood itself. So you can see maybe why this is important in the fact that it inspires future generations in order to go into that field and to do those things such as hip hop or such as Hollywood and movies and whatnot. So this is the same exact thing with ESL doing a women's only tournament, is that it allows the ability to create role models for the future. It's not actually going to help that much in the current present, which I think that's maybe what a lot of people have a problem with, is the fact that they want immediate results right now. But there are some things that you just can't do within the space of an industry, which is going to help immediately. And so I think this is one of the things into which we're not going to see the immediate benefits from it. But I think in future times we will actually be able to see as people go through the annals of history and say, oh, hey, like, remember this team from, this particular tournament, it was all female tournament, like, wow, that's really something great. And so that gives an inspiration. Now, secondly, of why maybe we need women-only esports tournaments is because you think of the multiple different barriers of entry, first of all, and the fact that it's just difficult to be a woman just as a regular gamer in, online gaming because you get harassed so much. But then you have another barrier of entry when it comes to the pro scene, right? And the fact that there have been several female pros that have said, that they're good, but it's the fact that if they try and join maybe a all-male team or they try and create a co-ed team, that they often get denied because, the male team says, well, we couldn't really function with you inside the gaming house, right? Like we can't handle having a female within, a male gaming space, a predominantly male gaming space. And so what are the females supposed to do? They're just not supposed to play games at the professional level. So this is an opportunity to circumvent the problem that was already there to begin with, that women can't go into, these male-dominated gaming houses, either because they don't think that they can, right, because they feel uncomfortable with it, or whether it's from the male perspective and that they feel uncomfortable with it as well, too. So you're asking too much to say that they shouldn't be able to go into these gaming houses, right? Or rather that they can't, and yet they also can't have women-only esports tournaments. That's just something that is unaskable in that regard. So I think with all of this and with all the barriers that we know that women face within, the gaming industry, or rather the esports industry, I think the ESL tournament is actually very good, and we won't see immediate benefits from it, but it is good for the long term and all things in that regard. So whenever esports gets brought up, with women and gaming, harassment obviously gets brought up, in the fact that there seems to be a perceived notion that women receive an overwhelming majority of harassment when it comes to this. But in fact, I don't think that to be the case. I think what is happening is that oftentimes what people do in forms of harassment or in forms of just toxicity is that they try and attack the weakest link that they believe that you have. And so for any women, for instance, if they have a female gamer tag, or maybe they say something in voice chat or whatnot, the quickest and easiest thing that someone can attack is obviously that person's sex. And so this is very common in terms of just people trying to inflict the most amount of harm to someone. And the fact that you could see this in chimpanzees, and that whenever they get in combat, like male chimpanzees, they'll often try and rip off each other's testicles if it's like a fight to the death, because they think that will cause, the most harm, and, that's a pretty good bet. So we as humans, we're not any different in the fact that if maybe someone's race, or if someone's ethnicity or something, maybe they speak in the comms and they have a different accent, then you just start to attack that. So I think that's a false equivalence when it comes to just people talking about harassment in gaming as far as the women's space is concerned. Secondarily, let's talk about why there are women-only esports tournaments, and the fact that, well, there are no male-only esports tournaments, right? So then that becomes a one-way street, right? It's the fact that women can compete both in the women-only esports tournaments and also the predominantly male tournaments, but there is no restriction for them to actually compete in that, versus obviously men can't compete in the women's only tournaments. So now you have this predicament to where it's actually favorable to the women in this regard, right? And if you think of just the beauty of esports, the great thing about esports is the fact that we have naturally brought down the barriers of what is the physical capability of someone, right? In traditional sports, and it's, on average, it's the fact that men are stronger than women. And so now we've broken that down in esports, and it's all about the mind, which we're equal, in terms of that. So that's the beauty of that. And when you introduce a tournament like this, you kind of destroy that idea of an equal space for people to compete with, whether that be male or female. Secondarily, it's the equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. First of all, who's to say who is actually in control of that? Who's to say that, you were the one that determines whether people can actually, be brought up in terms of their status, and that you think that they're underprivileged, right? That's just your opinion, first of all. And second of all, even if you do believe that to be the case, how do we put the brakes on when to stop? When is enough? When do we say, okay, now there are too many female only tournaments and maybe we could do away with this? Like, when do the points or the brakes get put on? And also too, like, how far do you extrapolate that in terms of the underrepresented groups within particular esports space? I mean, you could make the argument that we don't have enough vegans on the broadcast, right? It's just like, how far of the arbitrary idea of what is to be discriminated against or underrepresented actually go in the space itself. So I think that women-only tournaments actually tarnish the entire purity of the sport itself, and the fact that really we just want to see the best people compete at the highest level, and it doesn't matter who that sex of that person is, or their gender, or any multitude of things, their race, ethnicity. It doesn't really matter. We don't care. And that's why too we also have a global esports, is because we break down barriers even in terms of language, and the fact that we don't even need to understand the other person's language in order for us to appreciate the high level or the high capacity in which they can play and accomplish in the game. So I think it's completely breaking down barriers in which, or rather constructing barriers in which we have already broken down, and this is a step backwards in terms of esports. So I think the big question that everyone has is, how does this affect the male esports scene? I mean, it's not like ESL went and said, hey, instead of 10 calendar events for men, or, for, I guess, what it would be open circuit, right? So anyone could join, even females, but realistically, no. But yeah, we're going to take 10 and instead we're going to do 9. And then we're going to have a women only, tournament, right? Like, I don't think that's how that conversation went realistically. So on top of that, I don't see how this affects it in the grand scheme of things, because obviously the majors are all men anyways, which is the most prestigious thing to begin with. Most like A-class tournaments or S-class tournaments, they're all men anyway. So like, how does this really take away from the male space for esports? Well, it takes away from male esports in the fact that it is actually technically a zero-sum game. Just when you look up the definition, and the fact that if one side wins, then the other side necessarily loses. That's exactly what this is. And the fact that ESL obviously have a bank account, right, with a finite pool of money. It's not like they have an infinite amount of money. And so they are taking $50,000 and they are setting that aside to a women's only tournament that not men can compete in. So they're barred from that prospect even of itself. So they're taking that budget and they're putting that towards women only. So yes, it's obvious that it takes away from men in that regard. It is a zero-sum game in this regard, because yes, also too, now you're considering, oh, well, it's not like they would use that money to, put it towards male tournaments. What else are they going to put it towards? Maybe they could put it towards advertisement of male tournaments. Maybe they could actually do another male tournament. Like so, and when I say male tournament, obviously I mean a tournament which is open to everyone as long as you're good enough, right? So it's not restrictive to male specifically, but it's just predominantly the male demographic that actually competes in those tournaments. But it's not indicative that, it's necessarily restricted to males. So yes, it is a zero-sum game in that entire regard. Look, just because, ESL is helping a minority group, or an underprivileged group, I guess you could call it, that doesn't mean that they have to try and help everyone or do something that helps everyone, right? I like to make the comparison of maybe a homeless shelter, right? And the fact that, okay, if homeless shelter are giving food maybe to their local area, are you going to complain that they aren't giving food to the entire state, or maybe to the entire country, or maybe then giving food to everyone, right? Not just the homeless. So you could see how that kind of idea gets out of control, and the fact that, yes, they do have to try, or rather they feel obligated, I guess, to try and help a particularly marginalized group, and so that's what they're going to do. But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily thinking ill of the other group itself. They just decided to help the ones that they thought needed the most help. So one question that I have actually is, how does creating a tournament where women have to, it's a women only tournament and they compete against women, which is just naturally, in this current state and age of what is CSGO, just worse competition, right? And the fact that, well, if you're playing against other women who are also bad as well too, how do you progress that scene, right? How does anyone get better? Because oftentimes you get better when you face better competition. So how does this actually help the female scene? Because, a lot of people would think that this would actually hold them back and put them in sort of, you could consider that like an echo chamber in that sense, right? Of echo chamber of skill, not of actual like thought process. But, well, I like to think of it like training wheels, for instance. When you first learn how to ride a bike, generally most people use training wheels, right? They don't start off on 2 tires and then end up scraping themselves up, and then maybe at the end of the day they don't actually learn how to ride a bike because it was so difficult to begin with. Well, that's the same thing of what ESL are trying to do. They're putting training wheels for a group that has already been left behind necessarily, and so they're kind of having to give them a little bit of a boost so that they can then compete at the highest level. I mean, not everyone has to play on nightmare mode of, trying to learn how to ride a bike on 2 tires. If there is a better way to accomplish the same end goal, then why not use that better way, even if it's easier to then accomplish said goal? I like to make the comparison of what oftentimes happened within League of Legends, and the fact that there were a lot of, high tier LCS teams who would compete against way lower tier teams. And when you compete at such a high disparity of skill, then you don't really learn much out of it because you don't actually know what you're looking at. That would be the same thing as Michael Jordan trying to train someone who doesn't even know how to play basketball. It's like the gap and the time wasted for all of that and for him to actually teach you is just useless when you could just go to someone else who maybe is more lower and closer to your skill level and can able to actually teach you and make you comprehend things as such. And it's just not a waste of a time, right? So it would be a waste of a time to have a co-ed tournament, and have them or force them to play amongst people that are just way better than them currently right now because of the situation that they were put in before of just being held back, right? So it doesn't make any sense to do that. That's why a women's only tournament is necessary, because it's a progression. It's the training wheels at first, and then you learn how to ride the bike later, and then you could compete later. That's the whole point of this. Look, all that I really can see that ESL can get from this is that it's just good for their optics, right? It's the fact that, we're all about inclusivity, and we're all about equality of the sexes or gender equality, etc., right? Which is obviously the big thing within this current day and age of what companies do, and so I don't think that this is necessarily what they're doing is trying to actually benefit women. I think that it's just something that's very topical for them currently right now, and would put them in good optics of both fan sentiment or company sentiment, etc. And also too, you have to think, how many sponsors are they actually going to be able to get from this initiative? Because when I look at it, I think of, well, sponsors are oftentimes interested in watch time. Well, how much watch time do female esports tournaments even get? They're obviously they're historically record time low. They don't even come anywhere near predominantly male tournaments. So now you have to consider what sponsors would actually want to do this, other than the fact that maybe they want to do this for the optics themselves as well too. I think we're going to be seeing a lot of that. So I think the only thing worth it from the perspective of both the sponsors and from ESL is the optics. Like, that's it. There is no actual, monetary incentive of them getting it from the watch time or getting it from having the prestige of having a high tournament with all these big players competing, etc. So yeah, I think that's the only incentive to actually do this tournament, and I think that's quite disappointing. Well, you think of how role models are good for any particular industry at all. I mean, we see, like, I think the most recent one probably would be Black Panther that I can think of. And the fact that that inspires people, like black people, for instance, and the fact that Black Panther was a mostly all black cast, right? So that leads great inspiration, because
that similar people of, maybe you're a little black boy or a little black girl, then you see that inspiration on the screen and you say, well, first, like, I could become a superhero or I could be strong, etc. For the children that are very small. But then, further on, it's that, oh, I can actually get into Hollywood or I can get into acting and, I could be a role model for other people. So yes, role models are important. Role models are important to see, and it's not just about optics. I'm sure, yeah, that has a little bit to do with how ESL are putting it off, because obviously all companies care about optics. I'm not saying that isn't necessarily have some grain of truth, but I think the better thing to take away from it is the positivity of that, this entire debacle, and the fact that I think the role models overweigh the idea of them putting things out because of optics. So you have to think in these two relative terms, and the idea that, well, even if there is something that is a little bit cynical about it, that doesn't necessarily mean that the overall good is necessarily outweighed. I think it's tremendously in favor of what they're actually trying to do, or what rather people want them to do, which is create role models and create future success for the entire scene. So if gaming is supposed to be equal, because we took out the physical aspect of, the physical competition of what generally sports is, and, we know that the human mind is pretty equal in terms of women and men, then why do we have to have a sanctioned event? They should just basically get good, right? Instead of just an artificial money pump, because this is exactly what it is. It's saying ESL are pumping money into a scene in which is already just not even a scene to really begin with. And most even esports teams or esports organizations don't have a female only team, and so they're just artificially pumping this entire scene, and they're expecting this money to then flourish and go somewhere else, but in fact it's probably just a dead end pool. So I don't get it from that perspective, in the sense that why would you artificially money pump an entire scene, because as we've seen before, it really doesn't work out. Oh, so just like any NA scene at all is necessarily an artificial pump. I mean, we could go on with the list in terms of, just think of League of Legends and the LCS, and the fact that viewership is dying, the players aren't as good, the system is just terrible in terms of growing talent. Like, how far do you want to go with that artificial pump? Or rather, Overwatch League, and the fact that it was probably the most artificial pump of all time, and the fact that they moved basically an entire country of people, right, like South Korea, and all the players there, because all the South Korean players are the best players, and they moved them all over to North America in order to artificially pump an entire franchise system that is currently failing and declining. Like, that's obviously an artificial pump as well. You look at StarCraft and how way back in the day they tried to make North American StarCraft successful, and that didn't pan out at all. And then you have obviously CSGO and what's pretty relevant today, and the fact that there really aren't any North American teams anymore. There are only a handful and a handful, because it's just the dying scene. So yes, there are artificial pumps that have been done before, but that doesn't mean that necessarily this hasn't been done in the past. And that's not to say that this isn't going to be successful, or it is, but it's certainly worth a try at this point. So, like, to say that this artificial pump is restrictive just to this, I think is completely forgetting the history of exactly how esports has been developed, in any regard, in any major esports title to begin with. Yes, but that's because of bias of the region itself, right? You solely based upon ping. You have to have a North American server. You have to have a Chinese server. You have to have these types of things for the general plebs to play on, and then that then trickles down into the esports aspect, and the fact that there are online tournaments. And the only way that you can conduct an online tournament, with competitive integrity, is that it has to be based around ping. So that's why you get these leagues popping up, like the NALCS or something like that in League of Legends, even though that they aren't really that great in terms of competition against the rest of the entire world. But it's all region-based. It's absolutely necessary for the integrity of the game itself and of competition. So when you cite all these different esports and the fact that, there's been like this money pump or whatnot, also too, you have to consider that with the region base itself and the sponsorships, that is essentially doing your sponsorships based upon that region. So you're going to have your like State Farm, right, is an LCS advertiser, and I bet that a lot of European people don't even know what the fuck a State Farm is. So like you have these different biases of the region based upon ping of the natural player base and all of that. And so I think just all in general, this entire thing of women in esports is blown out of proportion in the sense that we need to create this artificial idea of them to try and compete. And not only that, but we're getting into the whole harassment thing and seemingly that they have more harassment, or maybe they aren't accepted within what is predominantly the male space of esports in video games. Now look, I think what all this boils down to is the reason why we have female-only tournaments. And I think that's because generally women haven't been accepted within the esports scene, right? It's not only enough that they had to go through all the shit and all the vitriol of just being a woman and gaming in just regular pleb online space, right? And then they got past that, they got good enough, and then they have another barrier of trying to get into gaming houses or a gaming organization and playing maybe co-ed with other men. And it's the fact that there's some just, frankly, weak-willed men to where they can't accept having a female on their team because they don't think that they can handle that type of environment, whether that be the woman or whether that be themselves or their teammates, in fact, and the fact that they just can't handle being around a woman, whether that be because of, like whatever sexual tension that they think exists, or just basically being professional in a business environment itself. So yes, I think that's probably the biggest thing that holds back women going into esports and getting into teams and whatnot. And so what are they supposed to do? Like they're just supposed to not compete? Like that's completely asinine. So the only other solution in order to actually have them grow and have them compete within the professional scene is to have women-only sanctioned tournaments, because clearly, these gaming organizations and these teams and these players can't tolerate having, females onto their team, whether they be good enough to do it. So this is the entire reason as to why we need these spaces, is to so that, yes, we get on those training wheels and we get maybe them being more familiar, in terms of males looking at females and being in the competitive scene. And then we start to kind of bridge that gap. And finally, maybe then we can actually have people that have good business etiquette and can decide that, okay, yes, you can actually create a co-ed team. So I think at the fundamental end of the day, that's what we're heading towards, but we're a long ways away from that. And so one supplementary way of, bridging that gap necessarily is by having these having these gaming tournaments that are just restricted towards women. Like I said before, I think it's people attack, someone being female because they want to attack the weakest part of that person, or what they perceive, what they would find themselves to be insulting, maybe if they were in that person's shoes. And so you could, it's a funny thing, you find this in common with a lot of children, and the fact that they try and insult someone's mother because, well, that's what they find a great affinity towards, because they're children and they're surrounded by their mother a lot, typically, right? And so that's what they try and insult, because they think in their childlike mind that, oh, that's the way that I'm going to hurt this person the most. So I think this is the similar thing when it comes to females being insulted because of their sex, is because they would receive the same amount of harassment from any other typical thing, but it's simply attributed to the fact of them being female, because that's the obvious thing that is to be attacked. All right, so first, I think it's pretty easy to debunk the entire idea that women and men get the same amount of harassment online gaming, and it's pretty equivocal, because if you've ever played, with like female friends or something, and maybe there's voice comms, or maybe they have like a very apparent female name, if there are no voice comms, you can overwhelmingly see that they just get an unnecessary amount of vitriol. And oftentimes too, it's not even criticizing their gameplay, but it's criticizing them just being female. Secondly, we've heard several different anecdotes of how difficult it is to be a female pro, trying to get further into the esports scene, and the fact that they get an entire like baseless vitriol against them, and the fact that they're females to begin with, and like losing to a female team, or we can't lose to a female team, etc. So yeah, I do think that they get a lot more harassment in this regard, and it's also the idea that, okay, well, you're saying they would receive the same amount of harassment based on any number of factors. It's just that they're trying to attack the weakest part of them or whatnot. But also too, you have to consider, well, when men get harassment, usually it's about how they game, or how they're doing in the game, etc. But these are things that they can change, right? They can change how they play, they can become better, etc. You can't change your asterisks, but you can't change your sex, right? Like, you can't change who you are as a woman and whatnot. So it's an immutable characteristic. So that's the big difference, is the fact that you're being harassed in something that you cannot change. So that whole argument is complete bullshit, and the fact that that criticism is necessarily the same as what a man would get.
So overall, I think that this is setting back the entire esports industry, and the fact that what we've done is we've created the most equal possible sport of all time, because it has to deal with the mind. There are no physical limitations when it comes to this. And not only that, but we've created the ability to actually compete in the privacy of your own home, as long as you have some economic status of having a computer and having internet, right? Which is a barrier of itself, but this is the lowest that we could come up with, and it's a pretty good system. And so with that, now we're introducing another, I guess, barrier of segregation, and the fact that what we should try and do is we should try and foster just the best possible players at any given point in time, based on any different region, any different sex, any different gender, etc. There are no limitations when it comes to esports, and I think that's the beautiful part about it, and that's what separates our sport from almost any other sport in the entire world. So this is going to put, I think, further barriers up, and it's going to create more animosity. It's going to create more bitterness, in fact, of just the entire, pro scene, and the fact that the tier 2 men are going to get pissed off that they aren't making as much money as the tier 3 women. And there's only a one-way path in this regard, in the fact that, men can't compete in women-only tournaments, but, women can compete in predominantly male tournaments. So this is just a further way to create more divisiveness within the entire community, and I think that it's bad, and I think that it just sets esports back a couple years. So I'd just like to say at the end of the day that I think we can make the space a little bit, more inclusive, as they like to call it, but it's true. And I think we're seeing a similar thing of what happened with racial slurs in gaming, and the fact that now you basically don't see it at all. And a lot of this is due to like chat restrictions and things like that. And also other part, it has to do with the gaming culture, and how gaming culture has entirely said, no, this is not okay. And so we're shifting more towards that, but now think of this in, the sexist aspect. I think this is what's happening, and that should be overall good for the scene. And so if we have to create these spaces, as I like to call it, the training wheels, then so be it, because this has been the repercussion, because we haven't actually dealt with the problem to begin with very early on. And so now we're at the stage to where actually we do need these things, because it has gotten so far out of hand. So yes, I think ESL is doing the correct thing, and this is one of the only avenues left in order to be able to actually foster a female or a women scene, and then to further grow into that. And I know that this isn't necessarily going to change things currently, but it should set things up for the future, and I think that's actually a smart business plan from ESL's perspective.